Hello everyone, you can call me Freebiewitz, and I'd like to welcome you to another episode of Analyse and Adapt, where I see if a video game would work in 3 different mediums. Tabletop, as in board and card games, tabletop roleplay, like Dungeons and Dragons, and finally, as a Larp. Today we're taking a look at one of my most favorite games of all time, Earth Defense Force 4.1 Shadows of New Despair. Long title, I know. Now, I'd do the sequel, but I have far more equipment and levels unlocked in this version, so I feel I have more material to work with for the video. So what is Earth Defense Force 4.1, and why is it one of my favorite top games of all time? Well, I could tell you about the spectacle of the explosions, I could tell you about the overpowered or wacky weapon varieties, or I could tell you about how many enemies you can face on screen at any one given time. But the truth is, I just love giant robots, and good lord, does this game scratch that fantastical itch right where I need it. But I'm not here to gush about just how much I love giant robots. I'm here to analyze and adapt Earth Defense Force 4.1 Shadow of New Despair, starting with tabletop. I've once heard someone describe EDF, at its core, to be a kid's idea of a video game. And I can't dispute that. There are giant robots, giant monsters, bugs, aliens to fight, and you get a lot of big guns, jetpacks, robots yourself, and tanks to fight them all, with a messy clash of light shows and explosions everywhere in between. While it'd be impractical to have every single figurine on the board at any given time, we can represent hordes with a single figure, a mound of them if you would. In the board game Risk, an army of soldiers is often represented this way as well, with larger groups eventually being represented by cannons, for example, for the sake of ease. For the giant group of ants, we can probably have a miniature look like a mound of ants, as I mentioned before, with larger numbers of them having larger and larger mounds of plastic. Shoot them enough and the figurine would shrink down until removed from the board altogether. Vehicles would work much the same way as weapons, but also have a HP stat along with ammo tracked by tokens, along with speed. Rapid-fire weapons would still use the ammo tokens, and we'll just assume for the sake of simplicity that each token for those weapons count as a full volley of shots, just so we don't have to keep counting every single individual bullet. Weapons in general would have circumstantial dice rolls and bonuses depending on their weapon type and what they're fighting against. For example, a powerful sniper rifle would do wonders against a large single enemy, but horrible against a swarm of bugs. While we could have the players roll multiple dice for quick-firing weaponry, that would slow down gameplay, so I'd just treat rapid fire as a modifier instead. Note that there's nothing wrong with rolling large amounts of dice, and I admit it can be quite cathartic. But for the time being, I'm just trying to smooth out gameplay to make it easier for my brain to digest. Anyways, there are a lot of different weapons in EDF, and not all of them are what you'd call optimal, even if we discount the weapons that are straight up upgrades or downgrades of others. I speak of joke weapons, which are hilarious to watch and use, but in my own personal experience, after using once or twice, I never touch them again, outside of a very few exceptions. Exceptions which are in the minority. If we adapt these weapons to the board, they wouldn't really do anything mechanically different from most other weapons, albeit in a weaker way in many cases. The blow-up decoy, for example, would just function as normal mines. The acid shot, which is a super soaker with acid, would essentially be a weaker, shorter-ranged flamethrower, and the air tortoise, while really powerful, is comically slow as far as guided missiles go, so slow that most enemies can outrun it. That said, its power and area of effect sometimes can be good enough to outweigh the negatives. But that, like I said, it's an exception. Unless the player wanted a challenge, most of these joke weapons wouldn't be used on the tabletop. Furthermore, the fun I feel just wouldn't translate all that well to a turn-based medium either, especially since we're limited by the models and figurines we'd be able to fit into a box. We could always subscribe to the school of tabletop wargaming like 40k or War Machine and have a model for each variant and loadout, but I'm not going to go down that specific rabbit hole right now. Honestly, I'm kind of on the fence about the joke weapons inclusion. Mechanically, they serve little to no purpose, but they feel so integral to the game's aesthetic and experience that it'd be a shame to remove them. I suppose the weapons and their description could be printed on cards, so even if we don't have a model of the weapon, they can at least live on in the imaginations of the players when used on paper. Anyways, with the weapons more or less sorted, let's try to adapt another aspect of the game. The board would start out flat, but have extra board pieces that could be placed on top, as the scenario dictates. The modular nature of this setup would allow players to reuse the same board in a multitude of different ways, and also allow them to destroy buildings during gameplay. Because they're flat, we could also have multiple kinds of boards, and even have them double-sided to save on space. Now, having players versus the game isn't without precedent, but for the most part, there are rules in place to determine what the non-playable characters would do in said other games. Sometimes it's as simple as having the enemy monster stand in one place as an obstacle. In some games, there's a specific area that the bad guys are trying to reach, and thus become predictable in their movements and easy to manage. For something like EDF, where multiple allies, both players and non-playable characters, exist, it becomes more difficult to determine which character the giant bugs would try to murder first. We can also have them go after the closest enemy, but something that simple could easily be exploited unless said enemy is faster than the players, which has issues of its own. Not that it's without precedent, once again. Ignoring all that, we still have to find a way to manage all these NPCs and how they behave. In that regard, we'd have them run off a script of sorts. I know I said having them go after the closest enemy would make them too easy to exploit, but we might have to do that. It's the lesser of two evils. Assuming we consolidate the groups of bugs into a singular entity, this can be made more manageable. If you can think of a way to do this better, please let me know in the comments, because I am scratching my head on this one. Anyways, now for the most important part of the game, the loot. In the video game, every time an enemy dies, they have the potential to drop health packs, armor packs, or weapon crates. Health packs are explanatory, while armor packs at the end of the level increase your character's max health, while the weapon crates allow the player to roll in a loot table. This seems pretty straightforward, but in practice it's not really that fun. In the video game, once you complete a mission, it gives you a moment before fading to black. Any crates that weren't picked up during this period are lost forever. What players usually do, because of this, is leave one enemy alive while running around the map collecting everything, usually using faster characters or vehicles to pick up the loot. This part of the gameplay honestly just feels like busy work, and I don't think anyone would miss the exclusion of this cleanup phase, as I'd call it. To that end, I think everybody would just be happy if we gave everyone the loot after the mission is done, regardless if they've picked them up or not. In fact, let's not even have weapon pickups, just leave health pickups. With that out of the way, let's move on to Tabletop RPGs. Due to the nature of tabletop role-playing games, managing NPC interactions is a bit more manageable than what you'd find in a board game. For example, moving dozens of models across a board game and determining who they'll attack is a bit more difficult than just saying, a swarm of bugs charge at you guys, two of which get in reach and go to bite you, and then rolling some dice. Furthermore, we can have NPC soldiers who fight the other bugs do so in the background as long as they're off camera, once again making things more manageable. Due to how abstract we make combat in the board game version, we haven't been able to get into the more nuanced mechanics of the game. Despite how I've described EDF, it does have a decent amount of complexity to it. For example, shooting a giant robot can throw its aim off, so if you have a big cannon in your face glowing brightly just about to blast you, you just have to blast it back and the robot will stagger, forcing it to shoot over your head. Hopefully. In theory, as long as they time their reloads right, a single soldier with a rifle can take on a 10-story machine this way, even if it takes hundreds of bullets to do so. It might look silly and janky, and admittedly it is, but it is part of the game. So, mechanically speaking, we can just take the weapon and their stats straight out of the game and adapt them here for the most part. The projectile speed of weapons can also be changed into a stat called effective range, much the same way Dungeons & Dragons does it. Homing weapons would have to be reworked to only have them exclude slower firing weapons. So while it wouldn't be impossible to manage, having to track multiple missiles in the sky over the course of several rounds of combat can be a handful. I can see it being very satisfying if done right, but for the sake of smoothing things out and keeping the game going, I'm probably going to change how the game would adapt here. As for the looting, we could just handle it much the same way we do for the board game version, But when it comes to leveling up or character advancement, you generally don't want to be too randomized. While it's not uncommon to have party members be more powerful than others, it's not common to find weaker ones having fun. When one player in most other tabletop RPGs is weaker than the others in combat, they usually have a way to make up for it and thus have time to shine. Sometimes they're sneakier, sometimes they're better at diplomacy. Point is, they're better at something. EDF by its very nature doesn't have anything outside of combat. We could insert role-playing moments where the players are resting up at base and the like, but the focus will always be on blasting, punching, and generally inflicting gratuitous amounts of violence on giant monsters. Now, there's nothing wrong with the combat-heavy role-playing game, but if you decide to adapt EDF, you just have to keep in mind that's what you're going to get. In terms of party dynamics, the video game makes it too easy to split the party. With vehicles, certain players having more mobility than others, and sometimes with explosions that throw allies across the map, it's very difficult to stay as a group. On the other hand, support items certainly encourage players to stick together, while tunnels and other such areas make it harder to split up, and of course vehicles that have multiple passenger or turret slots make it even easier to, well, like I said, stick together. But in my experience, the one thing that always brings players together in a video game is being knocked out. Like many other co-op shooter games, when you reach 0 hit points, an ally can run up to you and get you back on your feet. Now, when I say that, you're probably thinking, oh, I just run over to someone, press and hold down a button, and my character will kneel next to yours and eventually you'll get up. Well, EDF is a bit different in that it allows players to do this instantly at a press of a button. However, doing this will cut the healer's HP in half when they do so. Once their HP is too low, they can no longer help their allies up. And of course, once every player is down, regardless of how many friendly NPCs are present, the party loses. Now, due to the nature of death in EDF, this means that individual players can never actually fully die on their own, and the only way to properly go down is with a total party wipe. This gives a very one-for-all and all-for-one vibe, something I personally find very appealing. On the other hand, it does downplay the danger a bit. In theory, I could stay behind while my other friends just risk it all, charge in blindly, and wait for me to fly in and pick them back up, assuming I play a very mobile character. The only thing limiting us at that point is if we don't get any healing items. Anyways, with that said and done, let's try and move on to another medium to see how well we'd analyze and adapt it. So this is going to be a bit shorter than some other adaptations when it comes to Larp, and that's kind of because that EDF as a Larp seems kind of impossible. To begin with, we can't do giant monsters, they're right out, and if we shrink them down, we need hordes of them to match the video game's spirit. And of course, at that point, why would it be called an EDF LARP in the first place? It'd just be soldiers shooting monsters, not giant monsters, normal-sized monsters. Friendly vehicles like tanks might be possible, but we can't really use the real ones unless their speed was somehow limited at the very least. Now that I say it out loud and think about it, we could in theory use vehicles as the giant monsters themselves if we go with this method. That's a big if though. Once again, all the above seems very impractical, even if we were rich enough to have that many vehicles to begin with. The safety concerns alone would ensure no one would want to organize it. Then we have the weapons. Melee weapons in LARPs aren't uncommon, but I don't think I've ever seen a mechanically powered foam spike used in one before. Dual-wielding giant weapons might have to be tweaked as well for the sake of safety. I don't know how strong you are, but they seem very unwieldy. It's just an accident waiting to happen. Then we have things like rifles, shotguns, etc., which are straightforward enough and have gel ball equivalents. I've said this quite a few times now in other videos, but having a melee opponent run up to someone with a gel ball gun, however, just doesn't seem safe. Now, assuming that we have the safety side of things sorted, we still have the problem of adapting guns with bouncing bullets, homing missiles, and the weird disco laser grenades that wing divers get. Adapting those would be near impossible. Speaking of the wing diver, having jetpacks outside of the ludicrously rich wouldn't work either. If I absolutely had to bring in the wing diver, I'd handle it much the same way that I handled jetpacks in my Battlefront video. To briefly summarize, I'd set up holes and other long drop areas marked by little sport cones or are the markers. Anyone who walks into these areas would fall down or be unable to reach the higher areas without taking a ramp. Characters with jetpacks, however, could bypass these obstacles. Then we have the issue of item drops, specifically the ones that drop items. We'd have to remove those. It's a personal opinion of mine that a LARP is an expensive hobby as is, and there shouldn't be a mechanical rule that encourages players to spend more than they already need to. It's one thing to impulse spend on weapons or armor that you want, but it's another to buy weaponry that you'll be replacing every 2 or 3 sessions. Something that this game would encourage if it was adapted 1-to-1 for LARP. Now, this can be mitigated by tying ribbons to the guns, to show that they behave differently despite literally being the same gun. A red ribbon, for example, would say the gun does more damage. Point is, the ribbons would all do different things, but that only puts into account the stats of the gun. We could limit how quickly a rifle can fire, making rapid or burst fire a different ribbon, but that would be it. At the end of the day, what makes EDF unique can't really be replicated in real life to any reasonable degree. The version would be so stripped down that it would hardly even be called EDF anymore. It's a shame, but blasting giant monsters would have to be relegated to the realms of video games, board games, tabletop RPGs, and of course, our imaginations for now.
To save our Mother Earth from any alien attack.
EDF! EDF! So that's my analysis of Earth Defense Force 4.1 and how it can be adapted into 3 different mediums. How do you think it'd work? Have any of you tried adapting any elements of the game yourself? And if so, how did it go? Comment, like, and subscribe, and maybe, just maybe, we'll come back to the subject sometime in the future. My name is Freebiewitz, and thank you for watching. EDF.